Way. All right. All right. So we're going to be looking at Yochanan Part 4. And say this will probably be a lengthy study because we're just now getting into the second chapter of Yochanan, and what we've discussed about Yochanan is the way that we're studying it is we're going to look at each individual story and how it affects us and how it relates to us in our growth and our relationship with Yahweh Elohim, as opposed to simply looking at it as history. But let's talk to our Elohim, and then we'll take a look at the wedding of Cana. So, Master Yahuwah, thank you, Father, for this opportunity to study your word. We ask tonight that you will open our eyes, open our ears, and open our hearts so that we can see, hear, and understand what your word means to us and how to apply it to our lives. And we thank you for it all. In the name of Yahusha, Amen. All right, so, Yochanan Part 4. In the last study of Yochanan, we concluded with this statement. By seeking the redemption, deliverance, and restoration of Yahweh Elohim, our defense begins. We introduce the desire to rebuild the ruined bridges between us and Yahuwah, and in doing so, we begin to seek, perceive, discern, and understand the truth in our relationship with our Elohim. And we live to obey and apply His word to our lives. In Yahuwah we find our stronghold and our security, which creates for us a solid foundation on which to establish a lasting relationship with Yahuwah, our Elohim. We come into alignment with His love, and we form a symbiotic existence with the Word of Yahuwah, which becomes our way of life, moving our existence into Yahuwah's house of provision and righteousness. What we gain and acquire from this relationship is the dedication, devotion, and trust of our Elohim. And we got this simply from when Yahusha was having his conversations with Andrew and Philip and Kepha and Nathaniel, that these names come together and formulate this particular idea. Everything in Yochanan is adding to our growth till we reach the final part of Yochanan, which deals with Yahusha's death at the Tav, and even that is something that is meant to inspire us to become more than what we are, even within that. But the Bazora of Yochanan, the Gospel of John, was written from a Hebraic mindset. It must be understood from this point of view, and that is so very critical, because when we look at it from a Greco-Roman mindset, we end up interpreting it as history, and then we have similar disagreements and arguments that the church fathers had at the beginning of the 4th century, that they develop creeds and whatnot because they're trying to figure out whether Jesus is God and all this other stuff, that Yochanan is not really meant to give us that particular information. It's meant to inspire us to build a relationship with our Elohim. But the Bazor of Yochanan has to be understood from a Hebraic mindset. Now, we looked at Yochanan, the immerser, in the second study of Yochanan. And in that study, we considered that we don't need an advanced degree or an ordination to build a relationship with Yahuwah or to help others find their way to Yahuwah. Yochanan the immerser is a representation of seeking Yahuwah by and through a knowledge of the Torah and the prophets. In other words, Yochanan the immerser represents Torah observant Judaism, not rabbinical Judaism. Torah observant Judaism says that you can make teshuvah and find forgiveness. Rabbinical Judaism says that you have to jump through hoops and only Mashiach or only Elohim can, through some miraculous process, bring about forgiveness. And this was brought over into the Christian mindset that you have to have some special formula in order to be forgiven. The Torah tells us that if we will humble ourselves and seek Elohim and pray, then he will hear from heaven and he will forgive our transgression. We have to be conscious of what the transgression is, and then he will bring us restoration and healing. So Yochanan represents Torah-observant Judaism, not rabbinical Judaism. Now we see a prophetic event when Herod, and Herod is a representation of compromised religion, that he beheads Yochanan. So what we see is that religion that has lost its truth in the Torah and the prophets removes the authority of the Torah and its observance. And this is represented by the beheading of Yochanan by Herod. We look a little further down the road, we're going to find that there was a split between what was becoming the Catholic Church and Judaism, and that they basically said none of that Old Testament stuff applies. So this is basically a prophetic thing telling us this is going to happen. But this is also telling us that something is going to happen within what we call the Yochanan community, is that the synagogue would very soon basically what we would call excommunicate the followers of Yahusha from being able to come into the synagogue. So the beheading of Yochanan is a representation of organized religion that has been compromised by pagan beliefs, removing the authority of Torah observant, well, believers, basically. The Torah observant Judaism of Moses, so to speak. Everybody with me? Okay, good. All right. So, the wedding at Cana is going to illustrate to us that we must consume the old wine of the Torah and the prophets before we can be blessed by the new wine that Yahusha makes possible by and through the word of Yahuwah, that is the water of life within us. There's a lot of symbolism within this particular story, and there is a lot, again, there's a lot of prophetic imagery within this particular Bezorah. So let's just read this. These are 11 verses that we're going to look at, and you'll notice it's only a 3-page study. So we're going to look at this little wedding of Cana, but these verses tell us a lot of information, a lot more than we could write in just 3 pages, but the relevant stuff is just here. And we begin in verse 1. It says, "And the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Yahusha was there. And both Yahusha and his Talmudim was called to the wedding. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Yahusha said to him, They have no wine. Yahusha said to her, Woman, what do I have to do with you?" Literally, what does that have to do with me or with you? "My hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." And there were set 6 clay pots after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Yahusha said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants that drew the water knew where it came from, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man at the beginning does set forth good wine, and when men have all drank their fill, so to speak, then the lesser wine is put out, but you have kept the good wine until now." And this is the beginning of signs that Yahusha did in Cana of Galilee that manifested his esteem, and his Talmudim believed him. So, something in Yochanan that's different than the Synoptic Gospels is they are not called miracles in Yochanan. They're called signs. Within the Bezorah of Yochanan, within the Gospel of John, there is actually something called the Book of Signs. And it talks about the signs that Yahusha did throughout this particular gospel. So we will consider the events in these verses somewhat out of order, which will allow us to see the orderly significance of them all. So first, let's consider the mother of Yahusha. This Bezorah was the last one to be written, yet no mention of her name is made. And just as a matter of interest, all the letters written by Rav Shaul, by Paul, to the assemblies, which we call the Pauline epistles, were written before the Bezorah of Mark was written. In other words, before Peter's kerygma, before Peter's oral history of the gospel was written down by Mark, around between 52 and 6, well, yeah, between 52 and 65, I want to say. These letters from Paul had been written, okay? So the Pauline epistles precede the writing of any of the Gospels, okay? And so none of Shaul's writings, none of Paul's writings mention her by name. In his writings, Yahusha is said only to have been born of a woman and nothing more. In the Bezorah of Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, her name is mentioned one time in chapter 6, and that's at verse 3, when they're saying, "Is this not the son of Mary and Joseph, and are not his brothers and sisters among us?" Okay? Matthew mentions her by name several times, but the emphasis is on Joseph, not on Miriam, not on Mary. Genealogy at this time is still based on the father at this particular time in history. When we read the Torah, the genealogy is always based on the father. Okay? And I was having a discussion with a friend of mine who is a Jewish man, and we were talking about genealogies, and I said, genealogy in the Torah is based on the father. And he looked at me kind of strange, and I said, that's right. In the Torah, it's based on the father. The rabbis changed it to make it based on the mother. So, but anyway, it is in Luke that Miriam is most developed as a character, and her genealogy becomes important. By the writing of Luke, the temple had been destroyed, and a large portion of the male population had been put to death. Rabbinical Judaism began its transformation from that of the lineage of the father being the determining factor of one's Jewishness, to the mothers being the one that determined the Jewishness of a person. And this would be locked into halakha, the rabbis, after the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, when the deaths of thousands of Jewish men and the rape of thousands of Jewish women made lineage impossible to track. This is all very important because there's a lot of emphasis. By the time Luke is written, there's a lot of emphasis starting to be placed on the woman as the deciding factor in the Jewishness of a child. But by the time Luke is written, and I'm probably giving it away because it's probably written in here, the followers of Yahusha, what Yahusha taught, is starting to make a radical departure from what Yahusha taught, heading towards a Greco-Roman mindset. So I probably did get ahead of myself. Another thing that began to occur in the Bezorah of Luke at the time of this writing was the deification of Miriam. This was among the many traits that the church would develop as it slipped away from its Torah-observant ways and its Hebraic mindset to a Greco-Roman mindset that allowed for the absorption of pagan practices to further the influence of what was becoming Catholicism. Why would it be important to develop the character of Miriam when Paul never mentioned her? Mark mentioned her once just in passing. Yochanan, after Luke, from a community that was still very much inclined to follow the teachings of Yahusha, doesn't mention her at all. But we have her beginning to be developed as people are slipping away from this Torah-observant Judaism into pagan practice. You have to have a goddess in order to recruit the populace of these pagan observant countries. And this will be very important in the 4th century when Christianity becomes, or literally Catholicism becomes the universal religion of Rome, or the official religion of Rome. Now you must have a goddess in order to recruit, or in order to entice the populace to become Christian, so to speak. Everybody with me? Okay. All right. So it is with this in mind that we can consider that Yochanan used the term the mother of Yahusha. Okay? The Hebrew word for mother is that means mother, but it also means a point of division or departure. So she represents 2 factors within this Bezorah of Yochanan. One, Hebraic, in that Torah observance in its true form brings forth the redemption, deliverance, and restoration of Yahuwah. In other words, she was the mother of Yahusha. She was the one that brought forth Yahusha. So if we understand that, the one that brought forth the redemption, deliverance, and restoration of Yahuwah, who was the Word, was the Torah. She is a representation of Torah-observant Judaism. Now, the other side of Miriam, she represents the division from or departure from the Torah observance that was taking place at the time of the writing of Yochanan. It was written between 90 and 100, and by this time, this departure was well on the way, that we were already heading into a Greco-Roman mindset. 140 years later, a man named Marcion would say that we no longer need what he coined as the Old Testament. We only need a New Testament. We need to write a Bible strictly based on the Gospels and not mention the Old Testament at all. Now, we've talked about this in the past. Marcion was exiled for this idea. 100 years later, in the Council of Nicaea, his ideas were cherished and they were brought in, and they formed the basis of what was developing as the Catholic Church. And this was when the split between Torah observant believers in Yahusha and what was becoming the Catholic Church also split, that you could have nothing to do with Judaism, you could have nothing to do with the feasts and festivals. Hebrew was banned from any, we'll call them sacred writings. Aramaic was banned, and everything started to come into the language of the empire, which at the time was Greek. So, anyway, so she represents 2 things. She represents the birthing of the redemption, deliverance, and restoration of Yahuwah, but on the other side, she represents the point of departure away from the Torah and the prophets of Yahuwah. So with this in mind, we can consider that it was the 3rd day when the wedding took place. The 3rd day is always going to be an important factor in a lot of things. Now, a wedding is a representation of new life, a union of the physical to the spiritual. Ish and Isha once again become Adam. Yahusha would be resurrected on the 3rd day, illustrating the open door to a new life for them that would believe and receive. Now, we have the water in the pots represents the word of Yahuwah, specifically the Torah and the prophets. That is turned into wine, representing the blessings of Yahuwah found within his word. But let's consider that the old wine has been used up during this event. Now, this wine is also a representation of the Torah and the prophets, the blessings of Yahuwah that were rejected by his people, and that with the coming of the Greco-Roman influenced doctrines would also reject that very same thing. The Torah and the prophets would be rejected, again, by the Universal or Catholic Church. Not so much that they would be rejected, it's just that they would no longer be valid. You still have to have the prophets so you can come up with all this end times stuff that people want to make millions of dollars off of books selling. But as far as having any relevance that we must pay attention to it, that was no longer the case. So this old wine, the blessing and the instruction of Yahuwah, was made stale by and through the halakha of the Pharisees, who would become the rabbis. Water is poured into 6 earthen vessels that are made to contain the water of purification. Now the word for earthen vessels in this particular phrase in the Hebrew is eben. And eben means stone. Now eben is also a word that means to purify. But it also finds its root in the word bana, that means to restore, to establish and to restore. So we have this idea that 6 is the number of humankind who was first formed from the clay earth, made to hold the word and the spirit of Yahuwah. And if we consider this word eben, that in order to be restored and established, they must be made to contain the water. The water is a representation of the word, but it is also a representation of the spirit of Yahuwah as well, which we will talk about more in later studies. A firkin is about 10 gallons, and each held 2 or 3 firkins. So if we say 2 times 10 equals 20, we see the letter kaf that represents blessing, and 3 times 10 is 30 that we see the letter lamed that represents instruction. So human beings are vessels made to contain the instruction of Yahuwah, and in storing it within themselves, they become pure and blessed. And if we will allow ourselves to contain the water of Elohim, if we will allow ourselves to contain that word, to live according to that word, then we also become restored and established in our relationship with Elohim. And through this process, we go through a purification process. We are literally made clean by and through the wine, which is also a representation of the blood of Yahusha, which we'll get to in another study. I just wanted to throw that out there right quick. So Yahusha refreshes the Torah within us and brings its blessing back into our being by turning the water into wine. This is the concept, but there's more than this simple explanation to consider. The mother of Yahusha approaches Yahusha with the issue that there is no wine. She doesn't say that the old wine has run out. She's simply saying that there is no wine. There is no more adherence to the word of Elohim. True Torah observance has ceased, and it calls out for renewal. Okay? What does she represent? She represents what comes forth from the Torah. She's a representation of true Torah observance. And she's saying there is no wine, that this true observance of the Torah has stopped, and it needs renewal. What was Yahusha going to do? He would bring renewal to our lives. But he would never say that the Torah is done away with and it's no longer relevant. He would say the exact opposite. Yahusha says that his hour has not yet come. And we're going to see this particular phrase throughout Yochanan quite a bit. The crucifixion, or we call it the crucifixion, whatever you want to call it, so the vehicle of sacrifice of the Tav, would be counted in hours. So complete renewal and restoration is not to be established at this time. This is a time of teshuvah and the renewal or renewing of the spirit of the human being, so that the hour of Yahusha's esteem at the Tav can bring full restoration. There is a process. We have to make teshuvah. We have to allow the Word back into our life. We have to allow the observance of the instructions of Yahweh Elohim once again into our life. We need to begin walking according to that Word, making it a way of life like we talked about last week. And it's a steady progress, a process that we'll see all throughout Yochanan until the final complete restoration is established by Yahusha at the Tav, where he says, it's accomplished. We've done it. Now, the requirement for this is found in the mother of Yahusha's instruction to the servant. She says, whatever he says, do it. Yahusha first says to fill the earthen water pots with water. So once we make teshuvah, we must restore the Torah and the prophets, the word of Yahweh within us, and we fill the clay pots with water. We fill ourselves with the word. We must return to following Yahweh Elohim's instruction and not leaning on our own interpretation, which is the dogma, doctrines, and traditions of the church fathers or the rabbis of the Talmuds. And we've talked about this is a serious thing. You know, people come out of Christianity and they get all excited about Messianic Judaism. First thing they do is they go down to half-price books and they buy the everyday Talmud, and they start to get into these books that they really shouldn't get into until they have a solid foundation in Torah. Because if you start reading the Talmud, or worse than that, you start reading books like Sefer Yetzirah, the Bahir, or other books of Kabbalah, then you really end up getting sidetracked. And there are Messianic congregations that have strayed away from the Torah so much that they now separate their men and their women. The women have to wear hair pieces. They try to act Hasidic as opposed to being Torah observant. So there is a danger in that particular thing. When we fill ourselves with the word of Elohim, when we become Torah observant and begin walking according to the instruction of Yahuwah Elohim, we need to be careful not to still try to grab from the influence of the church fathers or the influence of the rabbis. And this is something that Yahusha said when the Pharisees were getting all upset because his disciples weren't washing their hands. And they said, why do they transgress the traditions of the elders? And the halakha says that you have this pot, and it's a special pot, and it has two handles, and you pick it up with this handle, and you pour water on this hand, you put it down, you pick it up with this hand, you do it 3 or 4 times, you wash and you've washed your hands. And Yahusha says, why do you transgress the Torah of Yahuwah in order to put your traditions before his instruction, is basically what he's saying. So again, we're putting the word within us. We're changing, like we learned in our last study, to begin walking according to the word. But we still have a lot of influences that we now, like we talked about last week, we have to be able to perceive, discern, understand what is and what is not, and then apply the truth of the word to our lives. So we must return to following Yahweh Elohim's instruction and not leaning on our own interpretations. It is in doing this that our master and teacher Yahusha says, draw out some wine and take it to the master of the wedding. The word within us refreshes our soul and becomes a blessing. And this is what we draw out to present to Yahuwah, our Elohim, the master of the wedding. Our relationship is recognized as better than before. What we're doing is the word within us refreshes our very soul. And this is what is presented before Yahweh Elohim. And he says the condition that your spirit is in is so much better than it was before you started walking according to the word. And it refreshes our soul and becomes a blessing. And this is what we draw to present to Yahuwah. the master of the wedding. Our relationship is recognized as better than before. That little mosquito hawk loves me. Through Yahusha, the word within us has been transformed into a blessing that will become better than the first once his hour does come. So we begin a transformation. We bring the word within